Hello and welcome to Coronavirus Capitalism, a special podcast series from the Socialist Party. In the coming days and weeks, we'll be talking about the unfolding crisis sparked by COVID-19, the novel virus at the centre of the most serious social health emergency in generations. We'll analyse the turmoil besetting the capitalist system, with businesses in many sectors going bust and thousands of workers losing jobs and losing pay. We'll examine the measures taken by governments nationally and internationally in response to the spread of the virus and the threat it poses to their economic system. We'll be asking the most important questions. What does this mean for working class people? And how do we make sure that we aren't made to pay the price? I have two speakers joining me by video link today. Seán Burns is a member of the Socialist Party. He stood in NI Assembly elections as the Labour alternative candidate for South Belfast. I'm also joined by Giuliano Bruneti, who is a member of Resistenze Internazionali, our sister party and the Italian section of International Socialist Alternative. Governments in nation-states around the world have granted the police and military new powers in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. There have been reports in the media of individuals being detained or issued with fines. We should talk about what exactly those powers are and whether they're actually the most effective thing in stopping the spread of the virus. But first, Giuliano, Italy has been hit the hardest of any European country by this virus, and the death toll has been absolutely horrifying, with over 18,000 people now dead. Could you give us a sense of the overall situation in Italy at the present moment, and then perhaps explain a bit about the new police powers that have been introduced?
Okay, so thanks for having me. And unfortunately, as you said before, the situation in Italy is extremely brutal, in the sense that there are 18,000 people that have already lost their lives due to the coronavirus pandemic. But unfortunately, those statistics doesn't show at all the reality. According to Borrelli, which is at the head of the civic protection unit fighting the pandemic, the number of people infected is actually at least 10 times higher than the number officially registered. And concretely, that would mean that there are, as we speak, millions of people in Italy, and worldwide, of course, that have contracted the virus without actually knowing it. The situation is a situation where the number of death, the death toll, is a strong underestimation of the tragedy. You just need to consider that, for example, in the region of Lombardy, which is a region in the north of Italy, which is at the epicenter of the crisis, there are in the city of Bergamo around 3,000 people that have died without actually being officially registered as COVID-19 victims. And this happened for a simple reason, the fact that people are not being tested, and not being tested meaning not being officially affected by this pandemic. So there is a silent massacre which is actually being carried out without being registered. And this is a situation which unfortunately is touching the most poor layer of society, but also the most weak layer of society. Let's speak about migrants, let's speak about disabled people, let's speak about old people, for example, in elderly care. And the situation is very harsh, especially in the health sector. There are more than 100 doctors that have died from this pandemic. Not to mention the nurses that have committed suicide out of fear of having infected others. So unfortunately, it is a real tragedy.
First of all, thanks Eleanor for having us, and thanks Giuliano for speaking. The kind of human impact of this crisis is astounding. Like, the death toll is climbing in country after country. You're seeing people die as a result of capitalist states not taking the appropriate precautions in order to tackle the crisis. And I think that the response of governments like in the UK and in other places in terms of introducing new sweeping repressive powers, such as the power to ban public gatherings, to introduce fines for people that are outside of their homes without a valid reason, is, in a sense, not enough in terms of tackling this crisis. Too little, too late. But it also stinks of a certain hypocrisy that, on the one hand, we have reports of police services using drones to spy on people in parks. And on the other hand, they're telling employers that they're not going to enforce closures, that they'll take them at their word, that they're introducing appropriate PPE and appropriate social distancing measures. And it just stinks of a certain hypocrisy, actually, that when people are seeing images of the London Tube circulating on social media with people rammed in like sardines, with workers in the likes of Moy Park, in APB Meats and so on, having to work side by side, it is a certain rank hypocrisy, and it will hit working class people the hardest. But I don't think that ordinary people will take this lying down. We've already seen workers in APB Meats, in Moy Park, Linden Foods, etc., organise walkouts in order to protect the health and safety of the workforce, to enforce social distancing measures and to enforce the demand for appropriate PPE. And it's something that I think is obviously very important in terms of this, because I think it points in the direction of, well, who actually knows best in terms of tackling this crisis? Boris Johnson in the UK has clearly prioritised the interests of big business and of the profiteers over the interests of working class people.
I think that one aspect that has been touched upon by Seán is extremely important, and it's the aspect of the worker response to this crisis. The idea that the ordinary people are actually dealing with this crisis in a more rational, in a more correct way than actually the leading and the ruling class is doing. In Italy, we have experienced a strong wave of struggle and of strikes, especially in the metal worker sector, but also in the chemical sector, not to mention the logistical sector. And people were striking for their health, for the right to go to work under safe conditions, and if those conditions are not met, for the right to stay at home without spreading their virus to their families and so on. We still have a situation in Italy where millions of workers are going to work on a daily basis, although we've been in lockout for more than 1 month. And of course, you don't need to be a scientist to understand that the virus will not stop at the factory gate, that the virus will not stop in crowded canteen, that people are taking crowded bus, crowded train to go to work. And of course, by doing so, all the other measures, all the repressive measures that has been, for example, introduced in Italy, and maybe we can develop that later, are completely useless in a situation where you have 6 million workers going to work on a daily basis. And this wave of struggle has been extremely important, not only because it has clearly showed a way forward for the whole of society, but also because those strikes were completely spontaneous, completely organized by the rank and file, without actually the support of the official union bureaucracy that have actually tried to downgrade those strikes, and they have signed a terrible agreement with the government and with the bosses, explaining that the production can continue under certain circumstances. And it is now clear that the bosses, that the ruling class, are responsible of mass murder, especially if you consider that the industry in Italy is concentrated in the north, in Lombardy, in the city of Bergamo, Brescia, which are the cities that are mourning hundreds of dead per day. And so by doing so, by pushing for their factory to be open, and by not acknowledging the reality that the virus will inevitably spread inside factory, the bosses are committing actually a crime against millions of ordinary people, and they are also, by the way, showing what is the value of an ordinary people's life compared to their profit under capitalism.
Hungary is one state that has made the news. Viktor Orban has been compared as a dictator and so on for the quite sweeping COVID-19 legislation that he has introduced. He has made what he deems misinformation about the virus punishable for up to 5 years. But it does reek again of a certain hypocrisy, because at the same time, his own government has been guilty of spreading misinformation. They have claimed that anybody under the age of 65 has no risk of a fatality as a result of this virus. They've also taken measures to take control of things like theatre. Over 100,000 Hungarian workers and young people participated in an online protest, precisely because they know what Orban is trying to do. Hungary faces a crisis in its health service, a crisis in the economy, and a crisis for working class people. He's taken measures to enrich the very wealthiest in society, and now workers have realised that. And I think those demonstrations are very important, because I think they're a sign of what's to come, not just in Europe but across the world, as government after government has failed to take the appropriate measures to tackle this crisis, as all the weaknesses of the capitalist system get exposed.
Maybe just to add a point on the question of repression, which is extremely important, especially in this situation in Italy, and not only in Italy. I think that there is a clear attempt by the ruling class to use this crisis as a way to strengthen their state repressive measure in order to prepare themselves for the inevitable mass resistance that will develop once the pandemic will transform itself into economical crisis. And let us be clear, the fact that they are trying to put the blame now on ordinary people for spreading the virus, on the elderly women going to the grocery shop twice a week, or for example on the isolated runner, is a way to divert attention from their historical responsibilities, from the fact that, for example, in Italy, which is formally 8th industrial power in the world, we are, after almost 2 months of pandemic, out of masks. There are no masks for ordinary people, no masks for workers in hospital, there are no ventilators, and there are not even gloves for nurses and doctors fighting in reanimation unit. And by putting the blame on the individual, they are really trying to distract ordinary people rage and anger against their responsibilities. The level of repression that is being used now in Italy is unprecedented. We have people that have been fined for not staying at home, and we are speaking about homeless people. We have police and military which are patrolling the street with loudspeaker explaining that we need to stay at home. We have geolocalization. We have drones that are being used to control the population and the gatherings. And most of all, we have fines up to 4,000 euro for people that are leaving, of course, their houses. And it's easy to understand that if you live in a big mansion with a garden, you have no problem in staying at home for a quarantine for 1-2 months. But if you're living in 20 to 25 square meters with 2 kids, in a situation where you have no light at home, in a situation where you have no balcony and so on, it's extremely difficult to stay at home. So of course there is, on one side, the need to respect the quarantine, but we also need to understand that the virus is not equal. It doesn't touch in the same way working class people, poor people, and rich capitalists, and so on. Just to give an example, we are in a situation in Italy where tests are not being conducted officially, but for the big politician, for example, the Democratic Party leader that has contracted COVID-19, well, he was subjected to 3 different tests. And of course, we are happy that his health is going well, that he has fully recovered from this sickness. But the situation is very different for ordinary working class people. 9 people out of 10 are dying at home without being able to arrive to a hospital, because you are not subjected to a test unless you have 40-degree fevers, unless you have very strong pulmonary issues. And that also explains why the death toll is so high. So just to add a point on the question of repression, there is a very harsh and brutal measures that is being used by the ruling class in this situation to avoid social unrest, and it's the fact that now strikes are forbidden. They are officially forbidden till April 13. The same situation is happening in France. The same situation is happening in Portugal. There is a clear attempt by the ruling class to destroy our collective rights, our collective freedom, in a way to let us pay for their crisis. And we need to avoid that. We need to be extremely clear and conscious about what is going on, about the need to resist, to organize, to fight for our right to health, but also to fight for our right to organize and to resist the capitalist crisis which is unfolding.
We've already started to touch on this point. In Hungary, the Prime Minister Orbán is now able to essentially rule by decree, passing bills without any sort of democratic process. Boris Johnson did initially try to get the new state powers in the UK to last for a full 2 years without having to be reapproved. And I think we have to consider that aspects of these laws are quite open to interpretation and could be vulnerable to abuse, like the power to disperse crowds. Could that at a later point be applied to protesters or to striking workers? So, Seán, what are the possible consequences of these new repressive powers?
I mean, I think we have a good lesson in how the capitalist state utilises legislation like this that it brings in under a certain pretext. The anti-terror legislation that was brought in after the 9/11 bombings was utilised to arrest the Stansted 15 protesters who engaged in a peaceful and democratic protest. And that's not for no reason. We have consistently warned that the state doesn't act as a neutral body, that actually people like Johnson, the civil service, etc., are tied by thousands of strings to the big bosses who finance their political parties, and they want to protect their profits. And that means, in effect, that they will utilize whatever weapon they have at their disposal to prevent ordinary working class people from getting organized, from starting to fight and infringe upon the profits of the 1%. And obviously, these powers are no exception. And I think what Giuliano was talking about earlier is that actually there will be a reckoning for this crisis. If you think about the hundreds of thousands of workers who have been opportunistically laid off by employers with no real safety net, when universal credit is overloaded and workers aren't able to claim social welfare properly, for what it's worth in terms of it's a minimal amount. And actually, I don't think that workers will forget this, actually. The government after government has chosen to bail out the big employers by giving them rent relief, rate relief, by giving them access to loans and grants, etc. Meanwhile, working class people are left on the scrap heap. And now that will come to bite. It will come to bite whenever this lockdown begins to get lifted. And they're getting ready for that. They're getting ready to ban public gatherings, potentially. They're getting ready to try to prevent workers from organising on the basis of the national interest or on the basis of public health, whatever their excuse may be. But we've heard it before. We heard it with the anti-terror legislation, that you can't protest because this is a violation of XYZ. We heard it with the miners' strike back in the 1980s. It's the same line of argument, and the same line of argument that will be repeated today.
On the question of repression in Italy, I think that it's really clear how this situation is being used in a very conscious way by leading politicians and leading figure of the ruling class in order to use this perfect storm to increase the level of repression against ordinary people in a situation where there is a certain mood and a certain request by ordinary people for the defense of social distancing, for avoiding the spread of the pandemic and so on. But we also need to be clear, those measures, for example, the fact that strikes are banned, police is actually arresting striking people in Italy, will be resisted by mass action. And also we need to be clear on the fact that the horrible repression that is developing in Italy will fuel mass anger. It is on one side done in a way to avoid mass anger, but it will actually develop mass anger. I'll give just one example. So there has been a huge revolt in prison, and officially 13 people have died of overdoses And of course, it's easy to understand that in a situation where police enters a prison with guns, with sticks, and with huge means of repression, including gas and so on, it's more likely that those people have had a different fate. But this is just to give an idea. What is happening in the prison is something that is being prepared against ordinary people. Because people are fed up, because anger is growing, because we have a situation where people cannot live anymore on food stamp, people cannot live anymore on very limited social aid, and now we have a situation where the police is starting to patrolling the supermarket, for example, because people are organizing themselves to go to the grocery shop and to take what they need without being able to pay, because the situation is a situation where mass poverty is developing, and in this situation it's absolutely vital for the ruling class to use the carrot, meaning we will give something, we will give food stamp, we will give a certain kind of aid of relief, but also the stick. We will make sure that the people that strike, that the people that organize struggles in community, in workplaces, in school and so on, will be severely punished in order to give an example, in order to scare people actually from joining the struggle and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think Giuliano makes a lot of important points there. There has been a certain media campaign to try to demonize working class people over the course of this crisis, to put the blame on the spread of the virus on us rather than where it is deserved. And I think some people will absolutely be sympathetic to some of the measures that have been introduced, because there is a reality that there is a small minority of people that aren't adhering to the social distancing guidelines, etc. I think there is a question for us. Well, is this the most effective way to really tackle that issue? And I suppose the answer is categorically no. That actually, rather than less democratic rights, we need more. Working class people, as they've shown already in the likes of APB meets in Moy Park, etc., actually have the power to enforce social distancing, for lack of a better word. And actually, the actions by working class people are more effective together rather than the actions of the police or military in terms of being able to ensure that appropriate social distancing and quarantine measures are introduced. Because I think, as Giuliano pointed out, the reality of what's happening in Italy in terms of gearing towards a mass impoverishment of working class people just forces people's hand. What are you going to do if you can't afford money to buy food? You're going to take it. And that can lead to situations where people just have to do it. That's not something I think that we can leave out of this discussion either, because I think it's an important element of it. I just think also the Ulster Unionist Minister for Health, Robin Swan, did suggest that the British Army could be redeployed into Northern Ireland in order to enforce the lockdown. And they've already been assisting in some civilian aid projects, such as the building of field hospitals, the distribution of medical supplies, etc. And rather funnily for an Ulster Unionist, he suggested that the Irish Army could also be involved in the process, which is not something I ever thought I would hear him say. But this is something that I think is an important question for us, because it kind of exposes the weaknesses in the health service, that the army has to be used in this way in order to ensure that medical supplies, etc., are distributed appropriately. It shows up the lack of preparation, despite warnings from experts that a pandemic was possible. I mean, over 10 years ago, experts warned the British government that actually a pandemic of this nature was possible and urged them to make preparations, which they didn't. And their reason for it was that they had to consider the cost of such preparations, which I think is something which exposes the kind of callous nature of the Tory government and of neoliberal capitalism, which clearly put the interests of profit before the interests of people. The second point to make in relation to this is that obviously there's a huge history of conflict here, that the British Army was not a neutral player in. It was a force which actively sought to play a role in the situation to push its own interests. They carried out various killings, colluded with loyalist paramilitaries, and that's not something that working class people will forget. And that actually the scenes of British soldiers being involved in civilian policing matters, I think, would just be met by resistance and anger. You can see the scenario playing out of soldiers deployed to the streets, and particularly working class Catholics reacting against it, because of the legacy and the memory of the Troubles, which was not that long ago. And I think for us, we have to oppose the deployment of troops on the streets precisely for that reason. It could really lead to an incredibly volatile situation. And I think we also have an onus to point towards an alternative. And I think one thing that has been demonstrated over the course of this crisis is that actually it's working class people, the organised labour movement, etc., that have led the way in terms of being able to fight the virus. I already mentioned the walkouts at the various food production plants, but that should act as a certain beacon for what is possible in terms of being able to fundamentally challenge the spread of the virus. That actually it is the self-organisation of working class people that is the most effective way in order to ensure quarantine and social distancing measures are kind of implemented.
I'll just add one sentence because I think it's very important, the point that Seán was making. I think it's easy to put the military on the street, but it's very difficult to remove them. That's why we really need to be conscious about what is going on. We need to understand that there is a certain need, that working class people want more protection, and that there may be a certain mood which is favorable actually at the present time to this kind of decision. But once the pandemic will be ended, all the repressive measures that are now being introduced will likely remain, precisely in an attempt to avoid mass unrest from below. So we need to understand that all those repressive measures, which are to some extent needed today, but they are of course being used by the ruling class, will actually remain unless we are able to build a balance of force, unless we are able to build a strong movement to oppose repression in our societies.
A number of activists within the climate change movement, including Naomi Klein and Greta Thunberg, have made what I think is a very pertinent observation, that there's a lot of talk about returning to normal, but normal was a crisis. And of course, they mean that in relation to the impending climate catastrophe that is being caused by capitalist production. But it's also true in so many other aspects of capitalist society. There's a crisis in homelessness and housing. There's a crisis of low pay and precarity. There's a crisis situation in gender-based violence and how it's dealt with in the policing and judicial system. There's a crisis in privatisation and underfunding in health services around the world. Normal can mean the undemocratic and violent policing of poorer communities and mass incarceration, especially in the US. And there's also the fact that it's often only criminality on the part of working class and poor people that is actually prosecuted. People on benefits, for example, are demonised, and if they take more than they're legally entitled to, they'll be pursued by the state. But Amazon and Apple, evading billions in taxes on their profits, will not. So let's talk about the idea of returning to normal. What is this normality? Who benefits from it? And what role could the police and the army play in enforcing it?
I think it's a very good question, because already we've seen employers chomping at the bit to be able to reopen as soon as possible. I think in particular in sectors like hospitality, they're seeing the sunshine and the summer looming and hoping to make an absolute killing in terms of financial returns they could make from a reopening of the bars and the clubs, regardless of this health and safety of customers or staff. I think normality in capitalist society is that the working class people face 0-hour contracts, precarity, low wages, struggling to pay rent, bills, etc. We see at the same time employers reporting record-breaking profits, enriching themselves 1,000 times over when working class people are left to struggle. I think normality has been the destruction of the planet. It has been the huge fossil fuel industries of private enterprise showing a complete disregard for the future of the planet and the future of the people on it by engaging in extremely environmentally destructive practices, everything from fracking, deforestation, the huge agri-food business, which bears responsibility for the development of this pandemic as well, that they're chomping at the bit to be able to ensure that they can maximize their profits now and in a so-called return to normality. Who benefits from it? I think, in a sense, it's a difficult question because obviously the lifting of lockdown measures, in one sense, everybody benefits, but it's those with what's been nicknamed an underlying wealth condition that benefit the most, that will be able to return to the rampant profiteering that they were able to engage in across every sector. But I do think that there won't just be a simple return to the status quo. Across the world, governments have opened a certain can of worms that will be difficult for them to close. The stimulus packages that have been announced in the likes of the US, the UK, etc., of the tune of billions of pounds, I think is something that isn't lost on people, that for decades they pleaded that there's no magic money tree, that there isn't enough to pay for public services, there isn't enough to give wage increases, there isn't enough to do X, Y, and Z, yet all of a sudden there is enough. The money is there, and it's only now that they've chosen to utilize it. I don't think they'll be able to plead poverty anymore. I don't think the big billionaires, capitalist governments, etc., will be able to say, we don't have enough to do this. And that can give a certain confidence that actually we can struggle and we can win more than what we're being offered by the employers and by the capitalist governments. The second part of that question, we kind of touched on this earlier, the possibility of the repressive legislation being utilized in order to help curb protests, movements, strikes, etc., I think is a real possibility in the UK. Britain likes to present itself as the kind of champion of modern liberal democracy and so on, but the reality is far from that. Whenever working class people have got organised, have struggled together, like what I mentioned earlier in relation to the miners' strike, they haven't been afraid to utilise repressive legislation. They haven't been afraid to utilise anti-democratic measures in order to try to break up working class organisations. And of course, we've seen the scandal of the spy cops, where left-wing groups were infiltrated by state agents in order to carry out spying operations and possible disruption. As well as that, the Prevent programme, which is used to educate kids on the danger of so-called extremist organisations, has seen a number of radical left socialist organisations placed on it, which says something about how both the state and the ruling class more generally is viewing the current situation.
But in relation to your question, and the question of the return to the normality, I would agree with the point that was made before, in the sense that, to a certain extent, the normality was the problem, and the normality has created this situation. The normality in Italy meant that we have cut public health expenditure of 37 billion in 10 years. The normality meant that we have lost 70,000 hospital beds, that we've made redundant 20,000 workers just in the last 10 years of neoliberal government. So there will be no possible return to this normality. But on the medical aspect of things, there is a sector of the ruling class which is now pushing for the total reopening, and of course I think it's a general situation in all the countries, as it was explained before, because they sense that their profit needs to restart. To that regard, they are completely contradicting even the official statistics and the official attitude of specialists that are speaking that we face a second wave of COVID-19 that could be actually more brutal than the first one, as it happened, for example, 100 years ago with the Spanish flu. when we are speaking about return to the normality, we are speaking about a situation where, for example, now all non-essential production is stopped, but we are still producing F-35 fighter plane, which apparently are essential. We are still producing plastic bags, which apparently are essential. So this is the normality of the bosses of the ruling class. And I think that people attitude, behavior, and mood will be completely transformed in the next days and weeks, not only from, a general point of view, but from a concrete material basis. We are speaking about millions of people that will be jobless. We are speaking about millions of people that will need to accept the idea that, for example, their holiday summers has been done now. We are speaking about millions of small companies that will be forced to close without actually any kind of state benefits. And this is potentially a social bomb ready to explode. Italy is an industrial country, but is mainly based on a small family business. There are in Italy over 5 million family business. And of course, all those family business, they are not receiving any kind of bailout by the state. And we're speaking about small restaurants, we're speaking about small shops that will completely disappear. Those people will fall into absolute misery, and of course they will need to react. They will be forced to react by the situation in itself. But also I think there won't be any return to the normality, because ordinary people will start to understand that maybe normality was the problem, in the sense that under normality we were privatizing hospitals. Under normality we had a situation in Lombardy, the richest region in Italy, where 40% of the beds are in private facilities. Normality meant neoliberalism. Normality meant this awful dictatorship of the industrial and the big capitalists. But I also think that the mood will change in relation to other aspects. If a company which is producing a beverage, which is called Ramazzotti, can change its line of production in 24 hours to start producing antibacterial liquid, then why can't we imagine, for example, to reconvert all the military industry to produce, for example, ventilator? This is an idea that maybe sounded extremely abstract and extremely idealistic some years ago, but today it's concrete. It's something that ordinary people understand, that ordinary people are willing to fight for that. And also I think there won't be any return to normality, not only because poverty is developing, but also because we are facing a situation where international relations are completely transforming. And this has a mood, for example, it reflects on the mood of ordinary people. Ordinary people are starting to ask themselves, how is it possible that countries like Cuba are sending doctors to Italy? How is it possible that Russia, China, and a small and poor country such as Albania is helping Italy, while big and powerful countries such as Germany and others are not moving a finger to help Italy? So there will be a certain kind of anti-EU mood that will develop, and this of course will also have the consequence to produce some kind of nationalist mood that will also be to a certain extent challenged by the global phenomenon that we are speaking on. So I think there won't be any return to normality. I think that we find ourselves at the end of an historical cycle, and actually I think that society will be very different from the one we have known in the past 10 years. That doesn't mean automatically that we will live under a situation of mass upheaval, of huge opening for the left, but the situation will inevitably transform the consciousness of millions of workers, of millions of ordinary people and youth across the globe.
Okay, Seán and Giuliano, a huge thank you to both of you for what I think was a really good discussion.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
For having us.
We want to hear from you. Find Socialist Party NI on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Socialist NI. For more news and analysis or to donate, go to socialistpartyni.org.